Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. In this segment, we would like to welcome back to the program, Seth Stern. Seth Stern is with the Freedom of the Press Foundation. He is the Director of Advocacy, and Seth was on the program not long ago with Associate Director of Project Censored, Andy Lee Roth. Seth Stern, we're having you back to talk about the so-called Press Act right now. And before I'm introducing you here, I just alluded to the fact that this is a potentially positive development protecting journalists and reporters. So could you give our listeners a welcome back to the program, by the way, Seth? Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So I'm eager to dive right in because it's not every day we get to talk about some good things that might be happening around the First Amendment and press freedoms. Tell us a little bit about the history of what is the Press Act. Of course, it is an acronym. So tell us about that, the history of it, and why we need it. Seth Stern.
So the Press Act is a reporter's shield bill to protect journalist source confidentiality. It would prohibit the federal government, whether it be prosecutors, the judiciary, from compelling reporters to burn their sources, essentially through subpoenas or through other forms of surveillance. Administrations from both political parties, both Obama, for example, and Trump, spied on journalists' emails. And this would prevent that. It not only would prevent spying on reporters through subpoena that are directly issued to reporters, it would prohibit enlisting telecom providers, phone and email companies to turn over reporters' confidences and, again, outsources. And it's important because journalists depend on sources. Oftentimes, sources are confidential, not because they're being weaselly and wanting to get anonymous quotes in the paper, but because they're people who have a lot to lose by coming forward. They could lose their job, they could lose their freedom in many instances. And when they can't come forward with reasonable confidence that their identities won't be publicized, they're often reluctant to come forward at all. So stories don't get told that should be told, or stories get told without the detail that should be included. Of course, some of the biggest stories in U.S. history were told through confidential sources. And there's long been a recognition of the need for journalist source communications to be privileged to some extent. 49 states, either as a matter of statutory law or case law from the courts, recognize some form of reporter's privilege. And the various federal appellate circuits, many of them, with some exceptions, like the Seventh Circuit, where I live, but most of the federal appellate circuits recognize some form of limited reporter's privilege. But the problem there is, one, the privileges are, as I said, limited. Oftentimes, they're kind of wishy-washy. They give judges a lot of discretion to balance the importance of the reporter's testimony against its necessity or its contribution to the proceedings. And when you're a judge and you're spending your whole life in a legal system and you're asked to balance the legal system's interests versus journalists' interests, inherently you're going to defer to the legal system because that's where you exist. That's where your biases are. It's sort of natural. And a lot of the privileges only apply, let's say, in criminal cases or only in civil cases. What that results in is when journalists are talking to sources and sources ask, what happens if you get subpoenaed? Journalists have to give basically lawyer answers. They have to say, it depends. It depends on the jurisdiction in which the subpoena issues. It depends on the circumstances. They can't commit to, I'm going to keep your identity confidential unless there is an imminent national security emergency or a risk that someone's going to die if your identity is not disclosed. And that's essentially what the exceptions to this bill are. If there is, a need to identify a terrorist, a perpetrator of terrorism, or some risk of, imminent harm, which is something that is unlikely to happen. I really doubt we're going to find ourselves in a situation where the key to stopping the next 9/11 resides in a journalist's notebook. And honestly, if it did, the journalist would voluntarily hand over that information. So it's good that those exceptions are in there. I doubt those exceptions are ever actually going to be needed. The other great thing about this bill is that unlike some past proposals, it defines journalist very broadly. Anybody who essentially regularly gathers and shares news with the public. It does not require that they be employed by some mainstream news outlet. It does not even require, as did the last Shield bill that was in Congress a few years ago, it doesn't require that they they earn their income through journalism. It defines journalism as a verb, not a noun. It's an action. If you are engaged in journalism, you're protected. There is the requirement that you regularly engage in journalism so that, somebody who posts on Facebook once can't claim the act's protections. But honestly, somebody who posts on Facebook once is not going to have sources and is not going to have news gathering material. So it's sort of irrelevant. The people who do have sources and do have news gathering material are going to be protected. And I think in part, actually, because of that broad definition, this bill is getting bipartisan support. Because look, plenty of small independent journalists work for conservative publications or are conservative journalists independently, have a blog, whatever it may be. This doesn't, this isn't some gift to the liberal media. This benefits everyone equally. So it passed the House unanimously. It has in two straight Congresses. It's passed the House unanimously.
That's amazing. I just want to interject to say how amazing that is.
Right. You wouldn't expect it because we've got this climate where, well, everything's divided. There's really, the political climate is so polarized, but especially when it comes to the media, you've got, the whole fake news narrative, liberal media. You've got all of this discourse about how biased and awful the media is. And then, on the left, people, of course, aren't fans of Fox News and whoever else among the conservative press. But despite all that, there is a recognition that the news media might be far from perfect, very far from perfect, but that doesn't mean that they don't need to have their First Amendment rights. If we want the news media to improve and to be the free and unrestrained press that we want it to be, then its rights to gather news need to be protected. One of the reasons why some news outlets function as, stenographers for the government and mostly print official spin rather than digging for the facts is because sources aren't going to come forward when they're afraid of potential repercussions, and because journalists don't want to risk, going to prison for not disclosing their sources or for their news gathering methods in the first place. When you've got laws like the Espionage Act on the books and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and others that are used to criminalize routine journalism. So anything that can be done to improve journalist rights is a positive, no matter which journalists any individual respects or likes, no matter what any individual thinks of the state of the news media generally. This helps whatever media you rely on. So as it passed the House unanimously in two Congresses in a row. Now it's pending in the Senate, where it also has bipartisan support. On the Democratic side, it's got Dick Durbin and Ron Wyden as sponsors. On the Republican side, it's got Lindsey Graham and Mike Lee. Wyden and Lee might not be all that surprising to people. Ron Wyden, he's got a family background in journalism, and he's on a lot of press freedom and civil liberties bill. Mike Lee kind of represents the libertarian anti-surveillance wing of the Republican Party, and I think that's the aspect of this bill that primarily appeals to him, and that's great. But then to have the sort of mainstream report of a support of Durbin and Graham, and that's particularly important. Not to get too much in the weeds of the processes here, but this bill is pending in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Senator Durbin is the chair of that committee. Senator Graham is the highest-ranking Republican in that committee. So there are two really helpful people to have on board with this bill. And speaking of people in leadership in the Senate, Senator Schumer has also been quoted saying he would like to see this bill on the president's desk this year. So there's some real support behind it, and we're just hoping that it will be scheduled for a markup in the Judiciary Committee so it can get out of committee and get in front of the full Senate while there's still time, because it is getting kind of, late in the legislative session, and we want that to happen right away.
Seth Stern, I can't help but think of the case of Julian Assange, although it's international and has various implications. But you had mentioned the Espionage Act as one of the many different tools the government has to try to silence or shut things down. And I'm particularly interested in the fact that, and you explained this very well, that it doesn't define a journalist by someone that works at an established outlet. Like, you don't have to have a press credential at the New York Times or whatever. You said very clearly that if you're a practicing journalist, a citizen journalist, you don't have to have a career or money, but if you have a record, a track record of reporting about things going on, that this would apply to you. That is correct. That's extraordinary because, in previous incarnations where we've seen some of this kind of activity, there actually have been efforts to kind of define what that is, or to clearly exclude people. And the kinds of people that are normally excluded are independent reporters, people that have different perspectives and voices. Could you speak to that just a little bit more? Because I just find that to be a really profound development as part of this.
Right. Agreed. In the past, I think before the internet and before the troubles, the financial troubles that the mainstream news media is facing these days, lawmakers were more comfortable trying to define what kind of journalism needs to be protected. So there was less resistance politically when someone would try to limit protections like these to newspaper reporters, television reporters, people with some sort of press credential. There was always resistance to that idea from First Amendment and press freedom advocates. It
Sure.
is, the First Amendment does not only apply to the institutional press. The institutional press didn't exist when a bunch of radical insurrectionists drafted the First Amendment.
Right.
So, there's no indication that their intention is to protect the New York Times.
No.
But among in DC in the past, there's been a higher comfort level with trying to define who is and isn't a journalist. Nowadays, even in DC, there is some resistance to that, both because people are not a fan of the current mainstream media for whatever reason, whether they think it's because they have a liberal bias or whatever it may be. People aren't that thrilled with the mainstream media that they want the protection to be on for them. I think for someone like a Mike Lee, it's more exciting to protect small, freelance, independent, upstart journalists than it is to protect mainstream journalists. So I think that, plus the recognition that the traditional business models of the news media are in trouble, and that there needs to be some breathing room for the media to evolve, and passing legislation at this point in time that only protects sort of the old model of media is not very forward looking, because that old model is pretty clearly on its last legs. So that's led to this moment in time where there is this willingness to protect sort of a broader swath of journalists and of news outlets. And we think that's a great thing.
And Seth Stern, you wrote earlier this year, and you've written quite a bit about this. You partnered with Clayton Weimer's Reporters Without Borders, and you wrote for The Hill. You mentioned a couple of more high-profile cases of journalists that were being attacked, including James Risen, right? And you mentioned another CBS journalist, Catherine Herridge, was at risk of being held in contempt. So there are actually issues, contemporary issues, and instances where the Press Act would come in very handy to protect people, correct?
Right. Yes, very much so. James, it's unfortunate that both James Risen and James Rosen are among the journalists who have been pressured to disclose their sources. It's very easy to confuse them, but I guess it just shows But this is a relatively commonplace occurrence that people with one letter separating their names have both fallen victim.
Which you wrote
But
about Rose. Yes, yes.
yeah,
Go
well, we
ahead,
wrote
please.
about both of them.
Yes.
At varying times, but yeah, Risen, I think back then was with the New York Times.
Yes.
Now writes for the Intercept,
And
and
Rosen was with Fox.
right, he was Fox, and he's now with Newsmax. Risen was pressured by, I believe, both the Bush administration and the Obama administration.
Yes.
Rosen, mostly the Obama administration. The Trump administration also attempted to access journalists' emails from the Associated Press, other outlets. The Biden administration at first continued that effort, then dropped it and actually enacted a Department of Justice policy restricting subpoenas of journalists. That policy, for one, it's just a DOJ policy, so it only applies to federal prosecutors. It doesn't apply to other agencies. It doesn't apply to defense lawyers. It doesn't apply to the courts. Two, it's a policy that can be repealed by any future administration, and the Trump administration, for example, almost certainly will if it came to their attention. The only hope is that they never even bother looking at it.
Yeah.
So we need more than a policy. We need a law. And yes, this is something that happens all the time, regardless of politics. Catherine Herridge is a journalist who was most recently with CBS before she was with Fox. She was subpoenaed in a civil case to disclose sources to help a plaintiff pursue privacy claims against the FBI, actually. And she would not. She stood her ground. She didn't disclose her sources. She was held in contempt of court. The judge fined her $800 per day that she didn't disclose her sources. Fortunately, the judge delayed that fine, stayed it pending her appeal, so she's not paying right now. But the risk of not only having to pay your lawyers, but to have to pay $800 a day in contempt fees, hey, that might be something you can handle if you've got Fox News or footing the bill. But if you're an independent journalist, that's not doable.
Yeah.
And past journalists, in Catherine Herridge's case, it's only a fine, but past journalists have done jail time. The Judith Miller case is the most famous. She spent several months in jail. Another case, the journalist who I believe spent the longest time in jail anyone ever has for not outing their sources, was Vanessa Leggett, who is a Houston-based crime journalist. She spent, I think, almost 6 months in prison in jail for refusing to out sources. And that's I like bringing that case in because it sort of drives home that these are not all political cases. It's a lot of the talk is national security journalism when it comes to someone like Risen or Rosen or like Judy Miller. But most cases where journalists are subpoenaed have nothing to do with presidential politics. And that's another reason that this is a bipartisan bill, because Vanessa Leggett's crime reporting in Houston, Texas, was equally of interest to everyone, regardless of political leanings. The journalist in Chicago, Jim DeRogatis, who broke the R. Kelly story about R. Kelly being a predator, he was subpoenaed twice for his news gathering information. I would hope that people of all political stripes see the benefit in a journalist being able to expose that a major celebrity is preying on teenage girls all over Chicago and all over Atlanta. So it's easy to get caught up in the sort of DC politics of this, but it's bigger than that. Journalism's not just about DC politics.
Yeah, Seth Stern, I'm really glad you said that. I apologize for the awkward backward way I kind of got into that question. My goal was to say if this is a bipartisan effort, meaning it's the Press Act has bipartisan support, but the effort to squelch journalists or to silence stories is also bipartisan.
Yes, both are true.
Somehow. Seth Stern, Director for Advocacy at Freedom of the Press Foundation. Anything else you'd like to share with our audience today, how they can follow your very important work at freedom.press?
Yeah, freedom.press is the website, at Freedom of Press on Twitter and all of the other platforms. I would encourage people, if they're so inclined, to reach out to their senators, especially if you're in Illinois, and can reach out to Senator Durbin's office, since he is the one who really needs to move this bill along and submit it for a markup at the Judiciary Committee. He obviously supports the bill, he's sponsoring it, but I think it's helpful for him to hear that it's a priority because he's got other things on his plate. If you are represented by a senator who is on the Senate Judiciary Committee, they're especially high priority right now, but really anybody, just reach out. This is never going to be the #1 legislative priority for anyone in the Senate. So for them to hear from their constituents that this is important to people, any extra motivation you can provide them is useful. We sent a letter yesterday, which Project Censored joined along with over 120 press freedom, civil liberties organizations, media lawyers, law professors. Hopefully that'll build some momentum, but unfortunately, an hour or so after we sent that letter out and sent out our press release, hoping that it would develop some buzz around this bill, the former president decided to get convicted of 34 felonies. So that sort of took the news momentum away from our campaign. So anything that people out there can do to talk to pressure their senators and let their senators know that this is important is really much appreciated.
Seth Stern, Director of Advocacy for the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Thanks, as always, for joining us on the Project Censored Show, and thanks for your very important work. All appreciated.
Thanks so much for having me.